On the morning of January 20th, 1953, as a gray winter sky hung low over Washington and the Capitol dome glistened with frost, two cars rolled slowly toward a moment that would become one of the most uncomfortable scenes in American political history. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags, craning their necks for a glimpse of the outgoing president and the man who would replace him. But inside the approaching vehicles, the atmosphere was far colder than the weather outside. Harry S. Truman sat in the back seat of the first car, wrapped in a heavy overcoat, his jaw set with the firmness of a man determined not to reveal what he felt. He had slept little the night before. Not out of anxiety, Truman prided himself on not losing sleep over decisions he could not change, but because the final hours of his presidency had brought a strange mixture of relief, resentment, pride, and disappointment. 8 years earlier, when he ascended to the presidency after Roosevelt's sudden death, he had walked into the White House unprepared and largely unknown. Now he was leaving it with a legacy that would shape the post-war world. But there was one unfinished chapter he could not ignore. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Dwight David Eisenhower rode in a separate car behind him, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. To the public, he was still the war hero who had commanded the Allied forces across Europe, the general who had overseen the liberation of a continent. But to Truman, he was the man who had turned away. The man whose silence during the 1952 campaign had wounded him more deeply than any speech could. And now, on this cold January morning, the two men were about to meet face to face for the first time since their bitter feud had spilled into public view. The tradition of the presidency demanded that the departing leader greet the incoming one at the White House, share a brief ride to the Capitol, and participate in a handshake that symbolized the peaceful transfer of power. But this handshake, this quiet, brief, seemingly ceremonial gesture, would tell the nation everything about the rift between them. Truman's car rolled to a stop beneath the north portico. Staff lined the entry, photographers positioned themselves carefully, and reporters prepared to capture the moment. A Marine opened the door. Truman stepped out, adjusting his hat against the chill. He stood waiting, staring toward the driveway as Eisenhower's car approached. The second car pulled forward, its engine idling softly. The back door opened. Eisenhower stepped out. For a moment, neither man moved. They simply looked at each other. Two leaders defined by the same war, the same era, the same responsibilities, yet separated by years of misunderstanding. Then they walked forward. Their hands met. The handshake lasted less than 2 seconds. To the cameras it appeared formal, almost routine, but to those who had watched the relationship deteriorate, from Truman's early admiration to Eisenhower's political silence to the bitterness of the 1952 campaign, there was something unmistakably cold about the moment. Truman's smile was thin. Eisenhower's expression was neutral. 20,000 days of combined public service stood between them, yet neither man seemed able to summon even a hint of warmth. What the public saw that morning was the end of a feud. What they did not see was the years of history leading up to that small gesture. Their relationship had not always been strained. In fact, there was a moment when Truman admired Eisenhower above all others. In the immediate months after Roosevelt's death, when the world was uncertain and Truman felt the weight of unprepared leadership pressing against him, he looked to Eisenhower as a symbol of confidence and clarity. He respected Eisenhower's command ability. He praised him publicly. He even offered, more than once, to support Eisenhower as the Democratic nominee for president. To Truman, it was an expression of loyalty. To Eisenhower, it was political entanglement. The misunderstanding grew quietly. Eisenhower believed soldiers should remain apolitical. Truman believed integrity meant openness. Eisenhower valued distance. Truman valued connection. And so, a gap opened between them, small at first, barely noticeable. But with each passing year, the gap widened. By 1952, it had become a chasm. When Eisenhower entered the presidential race, Truman felt blindsided. He believed Eisenhower had misled him, intentionally or not, about his political ambitions. He felt that Eisenhower owed him clarity, owed him honesty. Eisenhower, meanwhile, felt that Truman had assumed too much. He believed that Truman's repeated suggestions about a political future had placed him in an impossible position. Accepting would betray his principles, declining risked offending the president. And then came the breaking point, the Milwaukee incident. Senator Joseph McCarthy had attacked George C. Marshall, Eisenhower's mentor, Truman's friend, and one of the architects of the Allied victory. Eisenhower planned to defend Marshall in a speech. Truman privately approved, but McCarthy's allies pressured Eisenhower to remove the defense at the last moment. When Eisenhower agreed, Truman felt something inside him snap. The man he had once trusted had chosen political expediency over personal loyalty. Truman never forgave him. The bitterness spilled into the campaign. Truman criticized Eisenhower's judgment and courage. Eisenhower responded with polite distance, refusing to engage directly. Their once cordial relationship dissolved into silence. And now, on Inauguration Day, they had no choice but to stand together. Inside the White House, staff expected a brief but cordial exchange before the motorcade. Tradition dictated that the outgoing president show the incoming one around, offer a tour of the East Room, perhaps discuss a few final matters of governance. But Eisenhower did not enter the White House. He remained standing outside. Protocol required Truman to walk out and meet him. And so Truman, the man who had once reached out with admiration, and Eisenhower, the man who had once held every expectation of political neutrality, met in the cold doorway and exchanged only a few words. Reporters later wrote that the two men spoke lightly about the weather. But what they did not write, what no microphone captured, was the weight of everything unspoken between them. The ride to the Capitol was silent. Truman looked out the window at the crowds. Eisenhower stared straight ahead. Cameras flashed as their car moved slowly down Pennsylvania Avenue. But inside the vehicle, there was no warmth, no ease, no respect that could be felt. It was not hostility. It was something far more complicated. It was two men realizing, at the very same moment, how far they had drifted from the place where their story began. Truman remembered Berlin in 1945, the first time he met Eisenhower as president. He had admired the general's steady composure, his quiet confidence, the way he stood at ease before crowds of liberated citizens who cheered him like a returning king. Eisenhower had been a symbol of strength at a time when Truman felt uncertainty pressing in on every side. Eisenhower remembered too. But he remembered the pressure that Truman, perhaps unknowingly, had placed upon him, the insistence that he enter politics, the repeated offers that made him feel trapped between duty and identity. He remembered believing that Truman's enthusiasm was sincere, but also believing that it would soon place him in a difficult position. Two men, two memories, two completely different interpretations of the same moments. That was the foundation of the coldest handshake in American political history. When they arrived at the Capitol steps, Truman offered one final handshake before stepping back. Eisenhower accepted it politely. Both men turned toward the crowd. The ceremony began. Truman watched as Eisenhower placed his hand on the Bible and took the oath. For all the resentment that had passed between them, Truman still believed in the peaceful transfer of power. He knew what it meant. He knew what it symbolized. He knew that despite everything, the campaign bitterness, the misunderstandings, the broken trust, Eisenhower now carried the weight of the presidency. And Truman, the man who had once carried it unexpectedly, respected that. As the ceremony concluded, the two men parted ways. Truman left for the train station to return to Independence, Missouri, where crowds gathered to welcome him home. Eisenhower entered the White House for the first time as president, beginning a journey that would define the next 8 years. But the story of their handshake, its coldness, its brevity, its symbolism, did not end that day. Because what the public did not know, what history would reveal only later, was that the cold distance between Truman and Eisenhower was not born in that moment. It was born years earlier, in the quiet misunderstandings between admiration and neutrality, and it would shape not just their personal relationship, but American leadership at one of the most pivotal moments in world history. The first days of Eisenhower's presidency were marked by celebration, anticipation, and a sense of renewal across the country. But inside the White House, the emotional residue of that cold handshake still lingered. Staff who had served through both administrations noticed the shift instantly. Truman's brisk, approachable manner was gone. Eisenhower brought an aura of military precision, formality, and distance. Decisions no longer flowed through improvisation or late-night conversations. Everything now passed through structured channels, scheduled meetings, and carefully prepared memos. To the public, this looked like professionalism. To those who had lived through the Truman years, it felt like the beginning of a new culture, one that would quietly rewrite the presidency. Eisenhower had stepped into office determined to demonstrate stability. He saw the presidency not as an arena for personal emotion, but as a command post. The formality he brought was intentional, a way of establishing order, clarity, and discipline. But to Truman, watching from Independence, Missouri, this structure sometimes looked like detachment, and it reinforced the belief he had carried since the campaign. Eisenhower did not understand the political burdens Truman had carried alone. In truth, Eisenhower understood them better than Truman realized, but his style prevented him from showing it. During those first weeks, Truman followed the news closely. Newspapers detailed Eisenhower's early decisions, his meetings with congressional leaders, his first press conference. Truman paid particular attention to Eisenhower's tone, whether he credited the previous administration, whether he acknowledged the challenges he inherited, whether he showed even a hint of appreciation for the man who had tried, in his own imperfect way, to support him years earlier. Truman did not expect flattery, but he did hope for something simple: recognition. It did not come. Eisenhower rarely mentioned Truman publicly. When he did, the references were procedural, technical, and distant. It was not intentional slight. It was Eisenhower's military instinct to keep personalities out of public statements. But Truman, who governed through relationships and loyalty, interpreted the silence personally. Those around him noticed. At breakfast one morning, Bess Truman asked whether he wanted to return to Washington for any special events. Truman shook his head and quietly returned to his newspaper. But the story of their strained relationship was not simply one of coldness. It was, in many ways, a story about two men trapped by assumptions neither had voiced. For Eisenhower, Truman's early push to recruit him in 1947 and 1948 had felt intrusive. Eisenhower had spent decades inside the military, living by the idea that officers should remain politically neutral. Truman's repeated suggestion that he might lead the Democratic Party had placed Ike in a bind he did not know how to escape. If he refused too firmly, he risked appearing ungrateful or disloyal. If he seemed open to the idea, he risked violating the principles that defined his career. Eisenhower assumed Truman understood this. Truman assumed Eisenhower would speak plainly if he felt uncomfortable. Neither assumption was correct. Through the late 1940s, their friendship existed in this unspoken tension, each man believing the other understood his intentions, while both quietly misunderstood nearly everything the other meant. By 1950, the first real cracks began to show. Truman struggled to navigate the Korean War, the rise of McCarthyism, and internal divisions within his administration. He needed unity from America's leading public figures. Eisenhower, then president of Columbia University and later commander of NATO forces, was one of them. But Eisenhower remained publicly silent. Truman interpreted the silence as abandonment. Eisenhower believed silence was the only ethical position a non-political military figure could take. The misunderstanding grew deeper, year after year, until the 1952 campaign brought everything to light. Truman watched Eisenhower become the Republican nominee with a mix of admiration and betrayal. He knew Eisenhower would win, everyone knew it, but he hoped that Eisenhower would show even a small gesture of solidarity during the campaign, especially when George Marshall came under political attack. Marshall had been mentor to both men. Truman had relied on him through the hardest foreign policy decisions of his presidency. Eisenhower owed his rise, in many ways, to Marshall's leadership and belief in him. When Senator Joseph McCarthy accused Marshall of treason, Truman expected Eisenhower to defend his old commander publicly. Eisenhower planned to. He had even prepared remarks praising Marshall's integrity, but when advisors warned that defending Marshall might cost votes in Wisconsin, Eisenhower removed that line from his speech. Truman never forgot it. He would later say it was the most disappointing moment of Eisenhower's life. Years afterward, Eisenhower privately admitted he regretted the decision. But at the time, he believed he was making a practical choice, one that would ensure his victory and allow him to govern effectively. He did not realize how deep the wound would cut. Truman believed loyalty was the highest political virtue. Eisenhower believed discipline was. The clash of those values turned their relationship from strained to broken. And so, when Truman offered Eisenhower the traditional White House tour on Inauguration Day, Ike's refusal was not meant as disrespect. It was meant as neutrality, an attempt to avoid awkwardness. But Truman interpreted it as a final rejection. In reality, Both men were trying to avoid embarrassment. Neither wanted to pretend warmth. Neither wanted to force an interaction that would feel false. But neither understood that their attempts to avoid discomfort only deepened the distance. After the inauguration, months passed before the two men communicated again. Truman returned to Missouri determined to remain silent unless asked for advice. Eisenhower settled into the presidency, focusing on the Cold War, the economy, and Korea. Each man believed the other harbored resentment. Each man believed the other would not welcome reconciliation. But the truth was far simpler. They were two men shaped by different worlds. Truman, raised in Independence, Missouri, believed that loyalty was expressed directly through conversation, openness, and honesty. He judged character by who stood beside him during difficult moments. For Truman, friendship meant showing up. Eisenhower, raised in Abilene, Kansas, believed that loyalty was expressed through duty, restraint, and discipline. He judged character by how a man performed under pressure, not by how loudly he declared allegiance. For Eisenhower, friendship meant respect, often quiet, often private, rarely spoken aloud. Their values were not opposites, they were mirrors, but neither man ever learned to see the reflection. Throughout 1953 and 1954, the Cold War intensified. Eisenhower navigated the end of the Korean conflict, oversaw atomic policy, and attempted to stabilize relations with NATO allies. Truman watched from afar, sometimes approving of Eisenhower's decisions, sometimes disagreeing, but always paying close attention. And gradually, something unexpected began to happen. Truman realized that Eisenhower was governing with integrity. Eisenhower realized that Truman had governed under pressures few men could have endured. But even as their mutual respect grew silently from a distance, neither man reached out, until the moment came when history forced their hands. It began with a funeral. In 1954, one of the senior statesmen who had served both administrations passed away. The funeral brought together political leaders, military officers, diplomats, and cabinet members from years past. Truman arrived quietly, taking a seat among former advisors and friends. Eisenhower entered later, accompanied by Secret Service agents. The two men had not been in the same room since Inauguration Day. For a moment, neither moved. Truman turned his gaze forward. Eisenhower hesitated, then walked toward him. The room fell silent. Eisenhower extended his hand. This handshake was not cold. It was not warm either. But it was human. A small gesture, a quiet acknowledgement. Two men, bound by duty and history, recognizing that whatever had once stood between them had been shaped by misunderstandings neither had ever intended. They exchanged only a few words. But for both, it was enough. Still, the journey toward reconciliation was not yet complete, and the handshake that would finally mend what years had broken was still to come. As Eisenhower settled into his first weeks as president, the White House felt strangely quiet to him. The halls were familiar. He had visited many times during the war. But now, the building carried the weight of expectation. Every advisor looked to him. Every diplomatic cable bore his name. Every decision reached his desk with an urgency he had never experienced as a general. Victory in Europe had been measured in battles won and cities liberated. The presidency was measured in choices, consequences, and the invisible pressure of history. Truman knew that feeling well. The day he left Washington, he felt both liberated and concerned. He had handed over the nuclear codes, written his final orders, and said goodbye to the staff who had supported him through some of the most difficult years any president had faced. But he also knew that the world Eisenhower inherited was not the world he had inherited from Roosevelt. The problems were different. The alliances were deeper. The stakes were higher. And the Soviet Union, no longer an ally bound by wartime necessity, was now positioning itself as a rival on every front. Truman returned to independence with the pride of a man who had done his duty, but also with the lingering ache of a personal relationship that had soured beyond repair. He tried not to think about the handshake, the cold silence in the car, or the long stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue that felt like a corridor between two eras rather than a shared journey. But the memory stayed with him, sharp and unwelcome. Eisenhower, for his part, had little time to reflect on the ceremony. Within days, he met with his new cabinet, reviewed intelligence briefings, and confronted the reality that the world expected him to manage crises with the same precision he had displayed at Normandy and the Bulge. But the presidency was not a battlefield. Its victories were quieter, its failures were slower, sometimes invisible, until they exploded into view. Still, Eisenhower moved forward with the calmness that had long defined him. He preferred structure, delegation, clear lines of authority. Truman had governed through instinct and relentless work. Eisenhower governed through organization and discipline. Each style reflected the man who used it. Yet as Eisenhower shaped the early contours of his administration, the shadow of his relationship with Truman lingered, not in official duties, but in the private moments between meetings, when he thought about the years that had led them to that cold January morning. He remembered the letters Truman had written during the war, earnest, supportive, generous. He remembered the trust Truman had placed in him, the confidence he had shown when the world was still uncertain. And though Eisenhower believed he had acted with integrity during the 1952 campaign, he could not ignore the fact that his choices had wounded the man who had once stood firmly behind him. History tends to judge conflicts between leaders in simple terms, right or wrong, friend or enemy, principled or disloyal. But the truth is almost always more complex. Truman and Eisenhower had never been enemies. They had never even been true political rivals. They were two men shaped by the same world, driven by the same sense of duty, but destined to misunderstand one another. Their feud did not end with the handshake, but it did begin to soften over time. Months passed, then a year, then another. Eisenhower focused on stabilizing the Cold War, ending the Korean conflict, strengthening NATO, and managing domestic pressures. Truman settled into private life, writing, lecturing, and reflecting on the years that had tested him beyond anything he had imagined. Still, the distance between them remained. When Truman wrote letters to Eisenhower, they were polite but cautious. When Eisenhower referenced Truman in speeches, he praised the office more than the man. In 1957, Eisenhower traveled to Independence to dedicate the Truman Library. The visit was more symbolic than political, a recognition that history outlasts campaigns, and that the presidency is larger than any personal slight. The two men met again for the first time since the inauguration. There was a moment of hesitancy, a shared awareness of the years that had passed in silence. Then, Eisenhower extended his hand. This time, Truman did not hesitate. The handshake was warmer than before, still formal, still cautious, but touched with the recognition that both men had carried burdens the public would never fully understand. Neither apologized, neither explained, neither reopened the wounds of the past. They simply accepted each other, not as symbols or rivals, but as men who had served the same nation under extraordinary circumstances. The moment did not erase the bitterness of the past, but it did something more important. It allowed both men to move forward. Over the years that followed, their relationship continued to thaw. Eisenhower visited Truman again. Truman sent congratulatory notes when Eisenhower recovered from illness. When Eisenhower left office in 1961, Truman offered warm words of support, acknowledging the dignity with which Eisenhower had fulfilled his role. Looking back, historians often focus on the conflict between them, the cold handshake, the silent car ride, the political wounds. But those moments, while dramatic, tell only part of their story. The deeper truth is that their relationship reflected the transformation of American leadership itself. Truman had led through improvisation and urgency. Eisenhower led through structure and restraint. Truman had confronted the first shocks of the post-war world. Eisenhower stabilized the system Truman helped build. Truman had sounded the early alarms about the Cold War. Eisenhower had enforced the boundaries that maintained peace. Their feud was real, but so was their shared legacy. The handshake that changed everything did not change history because of its coldness. It changed history because it marked the moment when the torch passed from one era to the next. It symbolized the tension between wartime courage and peacetime caution, between personal loyalty and public responsibility, between the emotional weight of leadership and the practical demands of governance. Only later, when both men were out of office, did they seem to understand what their handshake had truly meant. It was not the end of a rivalry. It was the beginning of acceptance, of each other, of their roles, of the world they had shaped. Truman once told a reporter years after retiring, "I like Ike, always did." It was a simple sentence, offered without bitterness, without explanation, without the need to revisit the past. Eisenhower, for his part, wrote in his memoirs that Truman had shown him kindness when he first returned from Europe, and that he had never forgotten it. Their relationship, strained as it was, had come full circle. Two men, two temperaments, two presidencies. One handshake that captured the distance between them, and one slow, steady reconciliation that showed the world something greater than conflict. The capacity of leaders to grow beyond their differences. We tend to remember the cold handshake, but the real story is what came after. The recognition that both men had carried the weight of history, done what they believed was right, and finally found a way to respect each other, not as adversaries, but as fellow guardians of a nation they both loved. In the end, the handshake that changed everything did not define their legacy. What defined it was what they built, separately, then quietly, together. That is the story of Eisenhower and Truman. Not a story of enemies, not a story of betrayal, but a story of two presidents who took the same oath, faced the same world, and learned, over time, that the measure of a leader is not how he parts ways with another, but how he understands him in the end. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the hidden corners of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.